Hi, everyone. My name is Inna. I am the Women's Committee Chair for Americans Against Antisemitism, founded by the former Assemblyman Dov Hikind to really combat the growing rise of anti-Semitism throughout our country. We also have with us today Mazal Barton, who is my Vice Chair. Mazal, you could say hi. And we have with us today a very special guest. His name is Kasim Hafeez. Say hi, Kasim.
Hey, everyone.
Kasim has a very unique story to tell us today about his journey from radical Islam to Zionism. So I think I'll pass it on to you now. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that intro, And I'm going to talk a little bit about my story today, my background and how I went from radical Islam to a Zionist and working for an organization called Christians United for Israel. So I guess I'll start at the beginning. So I grew up in the UK. My family came to the UK from Pakistan, and they still are very devout and observant Muslims. And they came to the UK as economic migrants. And honestly, it was a very conventional immigrant story. They came for better economical opportunities, educational opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's interesting because I think it's particularly common in the United Kingdom. Immigrant communities, when they come, they kind of stick together. So I grew up in a predominantly Pakistani Muslim community. And while Islam was a predominant feature of everyday life, it wasn't a community which was radical or extreme. And I will touch on that because I would be the first to admit, being somebody who, I don't know if I'd say was a victim of, but somebody who's indoctrinated with, there is a very real issue with radical Islam within Muslim communities, and that has to be addressed. The community I grew up in, though, was not radical or extreme compared to today, or just in general on most issues. And on the whole, it wasn't an awful place to grow up. There are issues that many immigrant communities face. But interestingly, so just to give you context, nobody in my community, wider community, had ever met anybody Jewish. We didn't have any interactions with the Jewish community. I didn't know there even was a Jewish community in Nottingham where I grew up until maybe 8 years ago. But there was this strong anti-Semitism which existed in my family and existed in my community, this out-and-out Jew hatred. And it would take many forms. It would take the forms in very common conversations. You would watch the news or watch a television program, and if Israel was mentioned, you'd hear comments such as, the Jews control America, the Jews are at war with Islam, you can't trust the Jews trust the media. Look, for my family, Israel was the Jews equaled Israel, and that was it. It was simple as that, which is interesting because, you still hear today this idea that the Jews control the media. And look, no assumptions at all, but if the Jews do control the media, you're doing a really bad job. I mean, I just want to throw that out there. No judgment. But these were things that were generally believed. And like I said, we had no contact with the Jewish community. Most of my family, I probably would say to this day, have never met anybody Jewish. But there was this level of hatred and hostility. Now, my father was a lot more extreme in the views that he would speak. And the other views I've just expressed are extreme. But he would frequently say things like Hitler was a great man, and one of his greatest mistakes was that he did not murder enough Jews. I mean, it's a shocking thing to grow up with. And I remember hearing this messaging from 7 onwards. But again, here's the thing. When you're 7 years old, 8 years old, these things are in the background. This isn't what you're thinking about. It's background noise, so to speak. But I grew up at a very interesting juncture for the Muslim community in the UK and the West in general. Because around that same period, when I was 6 or 7 years old, there was a book which was published called Satanic Verses which would essentially turn perceptions of and attitudes in the Muslim community completely on their head. So for those who have never heard of the book, Satanic Verses was a book written by Salman Rushdie, which, while a work of fiction, it used elements from Islam, and many Muslims felt that it was offensive to Islam, to Muhammad, and figures which are sacred within Islamic tradition. Now, here was the challenge, though. So for my grandparents' generation, who have come from countries like Pakistan, which have very strong blasphemy laws, where you cannot say anything about Islam or defame the Prophet or offend the Prophet without either ending up in prison or on death row, which is still the case in Pakistan today. Here they're living in a Western society, which they have chose to come to, enjoying the benefits that they are afforded. But now something so sacred to them is they fell under attack in this society. And the reaction that prompted was noisy, violent, and for many people in the West, pretty scary. I think what really triggered, I would say, this really change in attitudes was when a copy of Satanic Verses was set on fire in Bradford, I believe, in the UK. Because the imagery that conjured up was scary. Burning books is reminiscent of the Nazis. So there was this real, for the first time, the Muslim community in the UK was being looked at from a perspective that hadn't really existed before. We, prior to this whole situation, existed almost as stereotypes, hardworking, they care about their families, they're very insular, etc., etc. And now you saw hundreds, thousands of young Muslims, many now born in the UK, who are angry, upset, and are calling for the death of a British citizen. This was further enhanced when Iran's ruler Ayatollah Khamenei issued a religious edict calling for the death of Salman Rushdie. And then you had bookstores being attacked, translators of the book being attacked all over the world. And this was really a watershed moment because I went to some of these protests when I was very young, and I grew up around this. And it was this moment where all these issues, it wasn't just about the book. There were many issues. There were feelings of not being listened to, feelings of not being respected, all these other issues that exploded in this volatile mix. And things changed after that point because it almost set up a dividing line where many Muslims felt, especially those who grew up, who were born in the UK, who had seen their grandparents deal with racism and things, that we're not going to be the same, we're going to be more vocal. And then from the other aspect, people looked at the Muslim community with suspicion because, there were these protests, there was violence, there was book burnings, and this was something that hadn't really been experienced in the West. So, this idea of a clash of civilizations, freedom of speech versus blasphemy, all these things now started to become questions asked. But one of the most damaging aspects of all of this was what happened afterwards. Because now what you had happen was two things, and one contributed to the next. So the first thing was that people of my generation, people born in Britain, now started asking very real questions about where do I belong in British society? And look, one of the interesting things for me living in America now, and I spent a few years in Canada before moving to America, is that there is, the best way I can explain it is this. Throughout my life growing up, I spent 30 years in the UK. Throughout my life growing up, I was frequently asked where I'm from. And, somebody asked, I'm from Nottingham. But that wasn't the question they were asking. The question they were asking was, you are brown, so where are you really from? Where are your family from? Where in the US and Canada, I've never experienced that. There is an attitude in the US, which is great, that if you're in America and you're an American, you're here legally, you're American. Like, it's as simple as that, it's something which really makes me love this country more than I already do. But that isn't something that exists in the UK and not in Europe in general. There is still this divide. So growing up, there was this idea of, where do I belong? Am I British? Am I Muslim? Where are my loyalties? How do I feel about this? There's this struggle for identity that I am British. Look, I'm not Pakistani. My grandparents were. I am British. I have a British passport. It's the only country, I was born in and lived in the majority of my life. Pakistan is where my grandparents are from, but if I go to Pakistan, they don't see me as a Pakistani because I'm not. I'm culturally British. English is my first language and all these things. So you're not really Pakistani. Well, you're not. And you feel that you're not really British. And into that kind of mix of confusion and struggling to find identity emerged these radical Islamist groups, these extremist groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir al-Muhajirun, who co-opted the narrative. And they told young Muslims, you're not British, you're not Pakistani, you're Muslim and you're Muslim first and alone. And that is the only thing that matters. The issue that caused was these groups were extreme. They didn't view it as a way to give people a sense of belonging. They used it to manipulate and essentially cause people to hate the country that they lived in and their country of birth, to cause this. They wanted to cause this clash of civilizations. And they created this narrative where they went, look, you are a victim of Western society. You being born in Britain, being a Muslim, no matter what your life is like, you're a victim of Western society. And look, like I said, I grew up in a neighborhood which had issues of poverty, illiteracy, and all these things which many immigrant communities face, especially when the majority of the immigrants who came from Pakistan to the UK were unskilled. They weren't doctors or professors. They were unskilled. So we had these issues. And instead of it being accepted, look, this is an issue that over time will improve, it was put in this lens of a clash. Because you're a Muslim, you're oppressed by Western society. Now, that's incredibly dangerous, because when you turn somebody into a victim, okay, let me take my example. When I'm told I'm a victim constantly, and then I accept that, yes, I am a victim, there's resentment, there's anger, there's frustration. But when the reality shows that you're not actually a victim, it's just you're a perceived victim, there is no way to rectify your situation. So rather than going, okay, this is what I'm suffering, I need to find a way to fix this, you are in this circle of hatred, resentment, and anger, which just bubbles up and becomes more destructive to yourself and people around you. And that was the narratives that was being spoon-fed to many young Muslims who are looking for belonging in the UK. So for me, at that time, I was growing up with this happening around me, but I wasn't really embracing it. I hadn't gone like, this is my calling. What changed for me happened many years later, and it happened in 2000. I went to Pakistan to visit family, and for the first time, I came face to face with an actual extremist organization. I saw Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Pakistani terrorist group who were responsible for the Mumbai attacks in India a number of years ago, and had been responsible for a number of attacks before. Their propaganda, their speakers, their recruiters were all over the place. I was in Pakistani-controlled Kashmir, visiting family, nothing else. And what really appealed to me about these extremist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba was what they represented. Now, here's the thing. When you take a step back and you look at it from a purely Western perspective, in terms of freedom and all these things, looking at the propaganda and the things that Lashkar-e-Taiba put out, it's terrifying. Talking about violence and terrorism and killing innocent people. Obviously, they don't put it like that. They frame it in a different way. To me, that was empowering. And I'll tell you why. Because for years, I had been given this narrative, and we're talking back when the internet wasn't a bigger thing as it is now. We're talking about handheld flyers being handed out with images of dead children from Iraq or Afghanistan or Israel or Gaza or wherever, with captions such as, these children were killed by, in Israel's case, the Jews because they were Muslim. These children were killed by the American army because they were Muslim. Now, there's a number of things about, and obviously this is still very prevalent because of the internet. It's become even more prevalent. But there's different psychological factors of that. When you see an image of a dead child, it causes an emotive response because anybody, everywhere, wherever, we can agree children should not be dying. Like that is a basic thing. Children should not be dying. Children should not be being killed. We can all agree that. So when you see a dead child, it's a shocking image. There are reasons the Red Cross or whoever use images of children suffering in their appeals. They do it to elicit support and get people to act. But in the cases that I'm talking about, which still exist today, when people are giving this narrative, there are two things which have been shown and proved. One, a lot of these images aren't what they seem to be. For example, in the last conflict that Israel was involved in, there was an image taken from the horror movie Final Destination, I believe, which was posted on Twitter as being from an Israeli airstrike. Was a lie. And also there are multiple cases of images from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria being used in this propaganda war against Israel and later proved to be completely inaccurate. So one thing, if somebody's trying to manipulate you, they're probably going to lie. So that's one thing. The second thing is they give you a context and they're trying to elicit anger and hatred. By using those images which elicit such an emotive response and then directing you to this is who's responsible, it's furthering that narrative of us versus them, that narrative of victimhood, and this is the enemy. So when I saw imagery from Lashkar-e-Taiba talking about fighting the enemies of Islam, talking about liberating Palestine, talking about all these things, it's empowering. Because as a young person, you're looking for a cause. You want to stand up and not be a victim, which is interesting. Again, it's an interesting juxtaposition where you embrace this victim mentality, but at the same time, you believe you don't want to be a victim, so you embrace the most extreme views. So after that trip to Pakistan, I started looking more into groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and their kind of extremist ideology. And it was very much at odds with the Islam that I'd grown up with in how dogmatic and rigid and extreme it was. And also it furthered this mentality of us versus them. For them, us was their stream of belief and them was everybody else, including other Muslims who believed differently. But it resonated as somebody young looking for something to belong to and something so simplistic yet extreme, it resonated. And one of the things that really stood out to me very quickly was the Jew hatred, which was so hardwired into this ideology. This idea that if you eradicate the Jews, if Israel no longer exists, the world will be a better place. That the murder of millions of people, men, women, and children, will somehow create a better world. And again, I thought about it. And again, when you read it right now, if I read it now, I'm like, this is absurd. But thinking about it at the time, it made sense from what I'd heard growing up, how evil the Jews were, how destructive the Jews were, the images of dead children that the Jews had killed. So all these things, again, all these silent influences, so to speak, had collected together to further reinforce my extremism. So I became very extreme in my religious views, but I really became an activist, and I would believe probably the most radicalizing period of my life was when I went to school. And I went to school, to college in Nottingham, not in Damascus or Cairo, in Nottingham. And from day one, you're bombarded with these anti-Israel messages. And I use that term very specifically, anti-Israel, because look, talking about it from my own perspective, and I was thinking that I did have some of the books here that I had when I was, an anti-Israel activist. Look, I saw myself as being pro-Palestinian. That was my mentality. And I had the scarves, the flags, the buttons, whatever, like you look like you're going to a soccer game. But ultimately, when I take a step back, I wasn't pro-Palestinian. I was anti-Israel. Everything I said, everything I did, everything I thought was directed at hating, denigrating, and seeing the destruction of Israel and the Jews. I don't understand, like, stepping back, how was that pro-Palestinian? If I was really pro-Palestinian, I'd be speaking out against Hamas. I would be speaking out against corruption in the PA. I would be speaking out against human rights abuses, women's abuses, all these things that impact Palestinians every single day. But not once did I ever speak or even consider those. My issue was Israel, and that's what I was focused on. So honestly, I don't care how they brand themselves, what they call themselves, Students for Justice for Palestine, Vegans for Palestine, whatever. When you dig down, it's an anti-Israel movement. It's not a pro-Palestinian movement. And that has been further reinforced for me when I've seen Palestinian peace activists being arrested, by Western pro-Palestinian activists being, called out and then arrested by Hamas. But so when I was at college, I became more engrossed in the anti-Israel movement. And one of the things that really stood out to me, to this day does, one of my first days at college, I went to a lecture which made no mention of the Middle East or Israel. Sorry, it was an event, not a lecture. It was a separate event. And for 20 minutes, we watched this video with very emotive images from the conflict in the Middle East. You had people with limbs missing, airstrike, etc., people at checkpoints, very emotive. No narration or anything. And it ended with the caption, "What are you doing for your brothers and sisters in Palestine?" Now you can argue, look, okay, why does that stand out so much? It stands out because it was such a powerful piece of propaganda, and it's so damaging to truth, and it's so damaging to young minds, because you're given these highly emotive images with no context, no balance, and then you're asking people, what are you doing? It's interesting. And you could again argue, I'm not tracking with you here. Let me give you a real world example. Years later, many years later, one of my family members went to the same college as me, had never shown an interest in politics, the Middle East, religion, anything. The Middle East was not even, we'd never spoken about it. One day she knocks on my door, very angry, very kind of red-faced, and launches into this tirade of how can you support Israel, they're killing Palestinians, etc., etc. Again, completely was not expecting this from this particular person. So I went, look, hold on, look, what are you talking about? And she explained how she'd seen this video and how awful the Jews were, how awful Israel was. And I was like, okay, look, time out. Let's take a second. Let's make a cup of tea and talk about this. So back in the day, being British, if you have a crisis while you're British, you make a cup of tea and discuss it. Now I'm kind of stuck in a strange place, like living in America, because, my tendency is to wanting to dump the tea in Boston Harbor, but it's a separate issue altogether. So we talked about it, and, she told me about this video, and like I explained, look, it's not that black and white. It's a lot more nuanced, etc., etc. But what stood out was 20 minutes. It took 20 minutes to somebody who felt a little bit of attachment because they were Muslim and were given a narrative that these are your Muslim brothers and sisters who are being unjustly oppressed. Here is the video evidence. Now go do something. And that reaction was anger directed at one person she knew who was supportive of Israel at the time. But while I was at college, I was involved in the anti-Israel movement, handing out flyers, doing events, you name it, But I got to a point which I find with all extremist ideologies that they do is they try and continue to push you. And I got to a point where I was where it was, okay, you're doing all these things, but what else? And looking at the world at that time in 2002, 2003, violence was the answer, because one, the narrative, the version of Islam I was following, violent jihad was the highest of things to do, and it made an impact, whether we like it or not. Look, 9/11, 7/7, horrific terrorist atrocities, but they focused the world's attention. And 9/11 was an interesting example looking back, and even at the time, where thousands of Americans were murdered going to work one day. And very quickly, the narrative skipped from this is evil and we must tackle it to what did we do wrong? What did we, the West, do wrong to elicit people flying in planes into buildings, murdering innocent civilians? It's a strange kind of skewed logic. But I believe that violence was the way forward. So I started making preparations, saving money as I planned to go back to Pakistan, go to a terrorist training camp, which would not have been difficult to come across, and then fight whoever, be it America in Afghanistan, or ideally the Jews in Israel. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And it wasn't this kind of eureka moment, I saw the light and everything changed. It was a gradual process. And the first thing that happened was I came across a book called The Case for Israel by Alan Dershowitz. And for the firstly, I didn't pick it up with this intellectual curiosity. I picked it up with this belief that this is Zionist propaganda. I know how wrong it is. I'm going to read it and prove how wrong what they believe is. I was a student. I was arrogant. I thought I knew everything. So I read this book and it challenged a lot of what I believed. Because here's the thing. When you believe something, you get yourself into an echo chamber of just hearing more of what you believe. So I read this book and it made some claims which I thought were absurd. It talked about how the Jewish people have had a presence in the Holy Land for thousands of years. And my narrative was the Jews came to the land after the Holocaust because of European guilt. It talked about, how the Jewish people faced Jerusalem to pray, how Jerusalem is a sacred city, all these things. It talked about how, the Israelis accepted every peace agreement, every partition plan, and the Arab states attacked, and all these things. And it talks about Israel today, democracy, freedom, all these things. So I read this and thought, this is complete rubbish. And I refused, this is just garbage. The interesting thing about Dershowitz's book is that he sources every claim he makes. And so I dug down and looked at the sources and all these things. But again, look, you don't read one book and it challenges you when you have a level of fanaticism where you're ready to kill innocent people because of what you believe. You don't read one book and go, got it wrong, who knew? So I thought, okay, I've read this, and now I need to prove this wrong. So I read the book, which was written as a counter-argument case for Israel, and while it had many emotive arguments, the actual fact and sourcing of facts was very weak. So I was like, well, that was unhelpful. And that eventually led to almost 2 years of me researching the Middle East obsessively, because 2 years is a long time. When you believe something so deeply, when it has consumed you, because that's the only term I believe is appropriate for so long, and you have your truth, but the actual research is saying, no, your truth is actually wrong. It's difficult, and you fight it, and you want to validate yourself. And after 2 years, a lot had happened. There was a distance between me and my friends as I stopped being as active. I was struggling with depression because, again, your truth, reality, they're not adding up. So, it's difficult to deal with that. And that then led me to do something which would eventually, change my life. And directly the reason I'm sitting here right now, I decided to go to Israel. I decided that I'm going to go to Israel. I'm going to see it for myself. And I knew nobody in Israel, spoke zero Hebrew. I'm going to read Arabic because I learned to read the Quran, but I can't speak a word of Arabic. I'm just going to go and I will see it, and it will be the awful apartheid state I believe it to be. And I can come back and then carry on the path that I know that my life is on. So one quick point, which will explain a lot. So before I went to Israel, again, like I said, I knew nobody. It was like booking a trip to a place you've never been with, no experience except, you kind of hate the majority of the citizens. So I went on the Home Office website, which is like the State Department in the UK, and the travel advice for Israel was Israel has a heightened security situation, all the things about travel, and, do not engage in any illicit activity, and always be honest when questioned. So I never traveled abroad on my own at that point. So 2007, I jump on a plane, go to Israel, land at Ben Gurion Airport, and I go through security. I'm at the passport control, there's little booths, hand over my passport. And, as you probably maybe all heard a million times, what is the purpose of your visit to Israel? I mean, being me, kind of naive in my 20s, never having traveled alone, I was super honest. I was like, well, listen, I'm kind of anti-Semitic, kind of anti-Israel, but I'm not sure right now. So I thought I'd come and see it for myself. And that's how you end up spending 8 hours in Ben Gurion security. So 8 hours is a long time, granted, but it wasn't a bad experience. And, I was asked a lot of questions, what is the purpose of your visit? Like, what you're saying is kind of strange. And at one point, the security officer who I was being questioned by took my passport, and he comes back and goes, okay, look, this is very strange to us, that you're 24, and this is the first country that you're traveling to. It's very strange when we look at it from what you've said. Took me a minute to realize that because my passport was so new, there were no stamps or visas. So I go, no, look, my passport is 4 months old. That is why it is the way it is. He goes, okay, so where have you traveled in the last 10 years in the region? So I went, Pakistan. He goes, why? I went, family. He goes, is that the only place you've traveled in the region? I went, no. I went to Saudi Arabia 3 years ago. He goes, oh, and walks out the room. So here's the thing. I went to Saudi Arabia as a religious pilgrim. And to this day, genuinely, I have not witnessed the level of racism I saw in Saudi Arabia anywhere in the world. And look, we're not talking about the Muslim-only roads or, Muslims and non-Muslims not allowed in Mecca and Medina. I'm talking about actual racism based on skin color, based on ethnic origin. And so that was very jarring for me back then. But here I am in Israel, which I have all these negative views of. And again, 8 hours is a long time, but there wasn't that same experience. And honestly, as time's gone on, the only way I can describe this security officer is he did what I call, like you have good cop, bad cop. He did what I would call like good cop Jewish mother. So on the one hand, he was asking me questions, very politely, very respectfully. On the other hand, he was trying to feed me every 10 minutes. So it was a strange situation where the security officer is going, well, you should eat something. You should, have coffee. And I'm like, look, I'm good. I'm fine. I just want to get this over and done with. And he would go, okay, fine, I get it. And would go get me coffee and food anyway. So either way, eventually I left the airport after, 8 hours and 15 pounds heavier, and was like, okay, let me get to my destination. My first stop was Jerusalem, and I did all the mundane things you do. And then when I actually spent time in the city, I was like, okay, I need to find this apartheid. Like, I genuinely believed apartheid exists in Israeli cities. So there are Arab-only bus stops, there are Jewish-only restaurants, like 100%. There was no doubt in my mind. And if you've ever spent any time in Israel, especially Jerusalem, that is not what exists. I saw people with headscarves and dressed as priests and monks and Orthodox Jewish people and people with green hair all like standing at the same bus stop. And that literally happened a few years ago. And I made an effort to talk to people. I spoke to Muslims, to Jews, to Christians, to atheists. I spoke to Jews who come from Guatemala. Like, I don't know if there were any Jews in Guatemala. I, again, had this preconceived notion all Jews are one. And that preconceived notion was shattered. I spoke to Israeli Arabs. And one conversation which stuck out to me was when I was telling this Israeli Arab gentleman how oppressed he was, me, coming from the UK, having spent less than a day in Israel, telling him how oppressed he is, he responded by going, look, it's very easy for you to come here and tell us how our lives is. For me as an Arab, there is no other place I'd rather live in the region. And he said, look, things aren't perfect, but are things perfect for you living in the UK, being from Pakistan, your family being from Pakistan? No. But again, you have this disconnect when you want something to be true, when you want the negative to be true, you somehow rationalize it with, well, we're not talking about that, we're talking about this. So all this was happening, but I was still like, the reality was in front of me, but I was still fighting it. And what changed, what really tipped everything off was not what I would expect. So I'd done all of this and I went, this is exhausting. I need to now like just take a break. And look, I'm a huge history nerd. So, headed to the old city of Jerusalem, and I, went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and I decided to go to the Western Wall. I had a vague idea what it was. I wasn't not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But I was like, okay, I'm like 20 something, Muslim. I don't know, like I'm not going to be allowed near the Western Wall, but let's try. So I go through, no issues. Walking towards the Western Wall, still thinking, I don't know about this. Like, I don't know what I'm doing right now. And then to add to like this level of anxiety and kind of stress was the Chabad rabbi trying to put tefillin on me. And I was like, I have no idea what this is, but get away from me. But eventually I'm at the Western Wall feeling super awkward. And I'm like, what do I do? Pray? Like rub the stones? Like, how does this work? And then I saw some guy next to me, like have his hand on the wall. I don't do that. It's simple enough. And look, it sounds super cliche, and I've told this story many a time, and I still believe it sounds cliche. But eventually my forehead was against the Western Wall, and it was like a real moment of clarity, like this moment where the outside noise and even the internal kind of stuff going on in your head, I kind of had a pause to kind of almost like disconnect. I'm like, okay, you're in Israel. You're in a Jewish state. You're at the Western Wall. Right behind you is the flag of Israel, that blue Star of David. These are people that you hated. Like you've had conversation after conversation and you've encountered nothing but kindness. And these are people that you hated. These are people that you wanted to kill. These are people that when pregnant women and children were being massacred during the Second Intifada, you felt they deserved it. Like, how did I get to that point? How did I become that person? And that was a really jarring moment. When you look at yourself like internally and like, I have become the worst kind of person. I have become somebody with not even a skewed moral compass. It's completely broken. Like, this is evil. But rather than kind of dwell on that and be like, oh my God, I'm so awful, I was like, okay, like, let's look at reality. You're in Jerusalem. You're at the center of the Jewish world. You have your hand on the Western Wall, the last remaining remnant of the Second Temple. And something really powerful resonated. I think two things, actually. One was that as somebody who was the child of Pakistani immigrants, who had grown up with the stories of Pakistan's early foundationing, how Pakistan was meant to be a safe haven for the Muslims of India. What Pakistan has become is a completely separate issue today, but the idea was, here is a place where we can live in safety, security, not dwarfed by a Hindu majority, etc., etc. So that resonated. I'm like, well, that's what Israel is. Here is long before a single Muslim had even set foot in South Asia, the Jewish people were here. This is the Jewish homeland, and they wanted to come home. Like, that was powerful to me. It made sense. It wasn't about politics or religion. It was about survival. And when I talk about survival, I'm not talking about a people. I'm talking about the survival of the single greatest story in human history. There is no greater story than the story of the Jewish people. There is no greater contributing factor to modern Western society than Jewish history. Before the Jewish prophets, if you look at the values of civilizations like Sparta and all these people, it was about elevating the rich, oppressing the weak, and all these things. And it was the Hebrew prophets who went, no, this isn't the way you're meant to live. Peace is an ideal. Care for the weak. Education is a right for all. And these are the foundations that much of our good Western society is built upon. But the other thing that resonated was I'm standing here in Israel, in Jerusalem, in a free, sovereign Jewish state. And tragically, there are 6 million Jews who won't see this. There are 6 million Jews who were murdered in my continent, in Europe, who prayed next year in Jerusalem, and they will never see the establishment of the Jewish homeland, which could have been the difference. And look, I firmly believe that Israel is not a result of the Holocaust. Anyone who makes that argument is ignorant of history and reality, basically everything. But I do believe if there was an Israel in 1935, 6 million Jews would not have been murdered in Europe. I believe that is just fact. And since Israel's short existence, it has played the role of ensure, because look, it's unfortunate, but the phrase never again has meant very little. In 1945, the world said never again. Since 1945, we've had Bosnia, Darfur, what happened to the Christians in Syria, what's happening to the Uyghur Muslims in China, Burma. There's so much, Cambodia. Sadly, we say never again, but what actually happens is the world looks the other way, doesn't act. When it acts too late, and then we hold memorials every year. For the Jewish people, Israel is the promise of never again. Never again will the Jewish people have to look to a world which looked the other way in the Second World War. It won't have to look to those countries who at the Evian conference went, sorry, we can't help you, even though you're trying to flee from the Nazis. It doesn't have to look to others for its defense. For the first time in a long time, the Jewish people have the right to defend themselves and to make never again for them a promise. They don't have to look to anyone else. And that I thought was incredibly powerful. And that really was the change for me. That was when I went, I've got this wrong. I'm wrong. But I couldn't just go, I'm wrong, and then move on. So I was in Israel for another 2.5 weeks, went all over Israel, went to the Palestinian territories, spoke to people from all sides. And look, the truth became very important to me. Like not important, clear, like this is the truth. I want peace. I want a better life for everyone, but you can't build peace on a foundation of lies. You can't have harmony when you go, this person is responsible for everything, we have no responsibility. Like that's not peace. That is, I can't even think of what that is. So as I was preparing to go back to the UK, I had two choices. I can go, I've experienced all of this, and now I want zero involvement with it. I'm just taking a step back. I was wrong, my life continues. Or I can go, look, I have contributed in poisoning people towards the Jewish people, to poisoning people who, towards Israel. And I felt how corrosive and poisonous that hatred is. I need to say something. I need to say something. So if I can stop even one person going through what I did, great. I also need to speak out because it's the right thing to do. Israel is a cause worth fighting for. So that's what I did. I went back to the UK. I started speaking to friends, family, anybody who wanted to have the conversation about what I'd experienced. And for me, I was like, look, I'm not doing anything wrong. This is what I experienced. All's going to be cool. Not what happened. And look, to kind of wrap up and not go on too long, it's been over like 12, 13 years now since I first went to Israel. In that space of time, a lot has changed. I have a non-existent to bad relationship with my family because of the views I've spoken out on. I have a tough relationship and non-existent with a lot of my former very close friends who just did not want to hear what I had to say and just rejected it offhand and rejected me too. Every now and again, look, I get death threats from people who are unable to use spell check or grammar, which is different levels of sad. And look, one of the reasons I left the UK was because it became very difficult to live in a community that you've spent your whole life and been part of, and now you are seen as the enemy, and every day you're looking over your shoulder. It wasn't a way to live. And Today I work for Christians United for Israel. I speak on college campuses, churches, wherever. And look, if I go back, do I regret any of the decisions I've made? No, not at all. Because absolutely it was the right thing to do. Absolutely it was the moral thing to do. And I sincerely believe, whether you're of faith or not faith, there's going to be a point in your lifetime where you will look back and have to be accountable for what you've done or what you've not done. And I do not want to look back and go, when the cause of my generation, and I sincerely believe that Israel is the cause of my generation. What Israel represents is greater than just Israel. Fighting anti-Semitism represents something much bigger. I want to be able to say that I did everything I could to fight these evils. Because if not, and genuinely, like, you can say this is just, rhetoric, but it isn't. If you're not fighting anti-Semitism, if you're not fighting the delegitimization of Israel, then you are part of the problem. Silence is allowing hatred to happen. And we're seeing how evil anti-Semitism is. And what's sad for me is exactly what I saw happening in the UK is being replicated in the United States, because there was an attitude that this cannot happen here. And that's when problems occur. That's all I have to say on that. So thank you.
All right. Well, Kasim, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your story, being so open and honest about your journey. I'd like to actually first start with one of my questions, if that's all right. You said that reading A Case for Israel is what helped you start to change your perspective. And now I think that most people may not take the time to read that book for various reasons. But so is there anything that you can point to specifically that stuck with you from that book that was most persuasive?
So I think thinking about it. So I'm going to be completely honest, and I know Alan Dershowitz now, so if he sees this, my bad. Reading The Case for Israel back, it's kind of boring. It's written in a very dry and boring style, like keeping 100. I think just things which, like, now working in the space, I think are so obvious, like the Jews and they're indigenous to the land of Israel. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know the Jewish connection to the state of Israel. A lot of people don't know that Jews aren't just, what the stereotypical image we have of the white Jew. There are all these, and again, we have this idea that we view Judaism as just a religion. Like, all those things really jumped out because they forced me to kind of challenge myself. But also, I think what is very powerful today, and like part of the things that CUFI do and other organizations, it's telling the stories. The human stories are so powerful, and that I sometimes think gets lost in things, because there's been a way of doing things in this field where, and I don't say this is criticism, there's this idea that if we just tell the truth, everybody will go, okay, you're right, that's the truth. We were wrong. We didn't realize that. It's not worked. It simply hasn't. Like, it just hasn't worked. And I'm not saying stray and don't tell the truth, but we need to tell the human stories. They're so powerful. But from The Case for Israel, those important things about Jewish heritage, Jewish peoplehood, Jewish link to the land of Israel, and also just kind of what really I thought was interesting for me was I grew up with this notion that Muslims and Jews always got on fine. It was all great. And when Jews lived in Muslim lands, it was all fantastic. But here's the thing. When historians write about it, they do it from this view that in Christian Europe, Jews were treated horrendously. In Muslim land, they were treated a little bit better, so it was okay. They weren't equal. It's not even close. So it's this skewing of history. And again, the story of Jews from the Arab world, from the former Soviet Union, I believe isn't being told enough. Like, all of that is part of this bigger human story, which I feel that has to be told and be brought to light to show, one, the diversity of the Jewish people and a knock-on effect Israel, and just the evil of anti-Semitism and how deep and how far back it goes.
How could Palestinians speak out against oppression from their leaders without being harassed and persecuted? As in the case of, this is an activist who was arrested by Hamas for participating in a Zoom call that was working towards peace. So can they
So it's so challenging because Palestinian society is so controlled on both sides, be it by Hamas or be it by the Palestinian Authority. What we have done, and again, it's been so challenging, like we've told the story in some of our very short videos about Palestinians who want peace, who are speaking out, but in most cases, we've had to obscure their identity. So I think it's important that those voices are heard because hopefully they can impact others. But I think this is something that goes, it takes a multifaceted approach. One, there has to be on a human level. Two, we have to, and we're going in the right direction. We cannot allow the hate education, which is happening in Palestinian territories, to continue. That is not building a foundation for peace. Look, Israel and the Palestinians tomorrow could sign the best peace agreement ever drafted, but you think a kid who's been brought up with 16 years of hate education, constant anti-Jewish propaganda is going to be like, cool, let's go hold hands and sing Kumbaya. It doesn't work like that. Mm-hmm. So any way the US government can put pressure to eliminate hate education and essentially create a freer society in the Palestinian territories is going to be a positive. But on the flip side of that, I'm defeating my own argument almost, it's very difficult in those kind of societies because sometimes you have to choose the best of a worst bunch. Like there's governments in the Middle East who we probably don't agree with, or we definitely don't agree with on a human rights basis. We don't agree with their values, but the alternative is more frightening to us than the current. And that is the real challenge that not only Israel and America have, but also America have in dealing with much of the Middle East.
Why do you think anti-Semitism is on the rise here in the US, especially with like Black Lives Matter movement? I'm not sure what is meant by that, but maybe why it might be on the rise if we have an environment here that wants to eradicate different kinds of oppressions.
Yeah. So I think anti-Semitism has always existed and is always lurking below the surface. I think that's true of Europe, and I believe in Europe, post-Second World War, anti-Semitism didn't disappear, just the shocking images from the gas chambers made anti-Semitism wrong. And then over time, it became okay again, reinvented as if you basically link everything to Israel, it's not quite anti-Semitism from the anti-Semites perspective. I think anti-Semitism is sadly deeply ingrained in the minds of a lot of people. And one of the major issues is that Jews are seen as the other. They're seen as the ultimate other. So they're an easy target. Look, be it from things written in the Christian world, almost every community that I can think of has some sort of negative stereotype that exists within that community when it comes to the Jews. That's like growing up, as I said, we were like, we're being oppressed by the West. This is awful. We just want equality. But that didn't extend to the Jewish people. Instead, we were attacking the Jews. So I think anti-Semitism is essentially a disease. And sadly, it is a go-to. Issues of white supremacy, issues of racism and Jew hatred continue to exist. They continue to have found fertile ground especially on the internet today, as we've seen with the rise of white supremacy. And I also think with certain voices within Black Lives Matter, they're influenced by people like Louis Farrakhan. Like Farrakhan is a prominent voice within the Black community. He isn't the only voice, and you've had people condemn Black Lives Matter because no community is a monolith. But anti-Semitism exists in so many communities. It's been rejuvenated and repackaged in recent years. And I just think ultimately it's this. Like I'm going kind of all over the place. Ultimately, anti-Semitism exists. At different times, anti-Semites feel emboldened. The issue is not enough people have resoundingly united and fought it and went, this is evil and it has no place in our society. It's at best being tolerated, at worst encouraged throughout different periods of history. And that's, I feel, where we're at right now. We have to draw a line and go, this is not okay in any shape or form. Anti-Semitism is racism, it's bigotry. It should be confined to the dustbin of history and turned into a fringe opinion, as with any racism. And I don't think that's been done. And that is the challenge going ahead if we really want to stop this ebb and flow that continues throughout history.
You somehow kept an open enough mind to explore your biases. What can be done to catalyze others to do the same?
So what I would say is this, and I've learned this through experience. One of the most powerful things is humanizing others. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is interacting with people. Like, genuinely, I can't say we had two different opinions. I don't know, huge hockey fan, Winnipeg Jets, yay. And I'm trying to convince you to become a Winnipeg Jets fan. And out of nowhere, I'm going to go like, hey, you should be a Winnipeg Jets fan. Here's a jersey. You're going to be like, dude, who the heck are you? Get away from me. But if we have a friendship, we actually connect on a human level, you're going to see, this is an awful example I've just realized. If we connect on a human level, you're like, okay, I see you as a human being who has these beliefs. Oh, okay, you're Jewish. So I'm no longer, or you're no longer the caricature, you're an actual human being with family and emotions and people we've had conversations with. And I think that opens the door rather than trying to, there is no silver bullet. There's no way that we can turn everybody into being a particular way, but we have to go out of our comfort zone sometimes and try and build connections with people from different backgrounds. So it creates a human connection, and then you can have those difficult conversations. Because I hate saying things like this because it's unfortunate that the level of anti-Semitism in this country is where it is, and globally it is where it is. But so many of the anti-Semites out there, so many people who make these disgusting comments about Jewish people have never spent any time or even have a conversation or have never had a Jewish friend. And so it's easy to create that caricature. Like for my family, the Jews were this evil thing rather than human beings who love their kids, who, want to force feed their sons and never want them to leave home and all these things, like things we have in common. And I think that is so powerful, and it opens the door to the difficult questions. And again, look, we all look at things and how can I change the minds of millions? If you're able to get through to one person, you can literally change the trajectory of a whole generation of someone's family. And that is really powerful. It's about building for the future rather than trying to change millions. If every person does something, it has a huge impact. And never underestimate how impactful what you do is. Like, genuinely, every person has a part to play and every person can make a huge impact.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.